My book uncovers the history of more than 50,000 young American migrants of Japanese ancestry who left the United States and migrated to the Japanese Empire during the first half of the 20th century. And this was a period of intense anti-Asian xenophobia and Japanese exclusion movement in the American West that threatened the survival of many Japanese families in the US and the future of the emerging community of young second-generation Japanese Americans who are known as Nisei, which means second generation in Japanese. And these migrants that I study in my book represented something like a quarter of the population of the US-born Japanese Americans. And their parents, of course, were Japanese immigrants who were ineligible for naturalization. And these US-born Japanese Americans in my book used transnational migration as a way to escape pervasive anti-Asian racism and to seek socioeconomic mobility in the rising Japanese empire in Asia. And there were also young Nisei children who were sent to Japan by their immigrant parents to acquire a Japanese education and practical skills in business or farming with the goal of one day returning to the United States and helping sustain their family businesses or farms. These young Japanese Americans came of age as immigrants who occupied a unique place in Japan's cosmopolitan empire. But many Japanese Americans in the Japanese colonial world also found themselves in an unfamiliar and frequently unwelcoming territory as strangers in their parents' homeland. Although many of these US-born Nisei settled permanently in Japan, about 20,000 out of the 50,000 Japanese American migrants returned to the United States prior to the Second World War. And many others moved back and forth between the US and Japan throughout the first half of the 20th century. I wrote this book with the interest in how these American migrants of Japanese ancestry drew the American West into the larger histories of nations and empires in the broader Trans-Pacific world, and in particular in the Trans-Pacific borderlands between the US and Japanese empires. As a US historian by training and as an Asian Americanist, I've always been interested in pushing the conceptual and linguistic and spatial boundaries of ethnic studies and area studies. And the story of these American migrants allowed me to do that. Here's a group of Asian Americans who were US citizens by birth, who found themselves in the Japanese Empire in Asia. And they lived in a fundamentally multilingual, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and transnational world that was intimately shaped by volatile US-Japan relations. So one of the things that the book does conceptually is to revise the United States as a national space and destabilize the positionality of Japanese Americans by reconsidering their subjectivities as an ethnic group, as a race, as a citizens, and as a community in diaspora. And they were much more than just a minoritized group and children of immigrants confined to the US borders. As transnational migrants themselves, they traversed multiple national and colonial borders, from the Jim Crow American West to the Japanese colonial frontiers in Northeast Asia, from rural towns all over Japan to the cityscape of Tokyo, from the World War II incarceration camp in Arizona to the city of Hiroshima on the eve of the atomic bombing, and back to their homes in the United States during the Cold War decades. And their experiences and their struggles for survival were intimately shaped by their social relations with diverse groups of people in both empires. Another important objective of this book is to trouble the notions about national identity, citizenship, and loyalty, which is central to the dominant historical memory of the Japanese American experience in the US and the scholarship centering on the legacies of the World War II mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, which is arguably the most widely taught and debated topic in Asian American studies. And there's a popular narrative of Japanese Americans as loyal American citizens and patriotic victims of wartime racism, who nevertheless proved their loyalty and rebuilt their community after the war and fulfilled the promise of American democracy. And that is a powerful narrative, but it is also a quintessential Asian American model minority story. And it is an emotionally satisfying and appealing narrative, which played an important role in the post-war Japanese American redress movement, which succeeded in compelling the US government to issue official apology and reparations for the wartime mass incarceration of Japanese Americans. But this kind of dominant representation of Japanese Americans based on the narrow conceptualization of national loyalty has pushed the transnational experiences that were remarkably common among US-born Japanese Americans throughout the 20th century. And this question of loyalty is what really got me started on this project. The life of this book began as a master's thesis many years ago when I was in graduate school. I had a rather ambitious goal then to rewrite the entire history of the World War II Japanese American incarceration in my master's thesis. Of course, I never managed to do that. I was very young and naive. But what I did eventually was that I started this project by reinterpreting the history of the Japanese American incarceration from the perspectives of US-born Japanese American migrants who had left the American West and settled in the Japanese Empire, then returned to the United States before the war. And this subgroup of Japanese American migrants became known as Kibei. And this is a term that I use throughout my book. Kibei means returned to America. There were close to 20,000 of these Japanese American returned migrants from Japan before the Pacific War. And during the war, they were stigmatized as those Nisei who had come back from Japan with the cultural baggage of being too Japanese. Many of them spoke English with a Japanese accent because they had been educated in Japan and spent many years in that country, as well as in Japanese colonies in Asia. And after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the US government treated Kibei as a potentially dangerous pro-Japan element within the Japanese American community. There was even a plan to separate the Kibei, more specifically male Kibei bachelors, and which is a term used by the War Relocation Authority, from the rest of the Japanese American population and place them in a segregated prison camp during the war. And that almost happened. And so that was based on the perception that Kibei, by virtue of their education and upbringing in Japan, were essentially Japanese in their cultural and political disposition, and therefore they must be perpetually loyal to the Japanese emperor. And Kibei were also ostracized by their own community. Many among the Japanese American community leaders who cooperated with the US government's mass incarceration policy during the war identified Kibei as a group that could potentially tarnish the image of Nisei as loyal Americans because of the sweeping representation of the Kibei as essentially Japanese in spite of their American citizenship by birth. So the war had engendered this enormous social burden for the Japanese American community to prove their loyalty to the US, even as they endured the humiliating experience of being prisoners in their own country. And this compelled many Japanese Americans to reject anything that could be perceived as Japanese and sever their ties to Japan. And this intense rejection of Japan resulted in the active suppression of Kibei's voices throughout the war and for many decades after the war. And such polarizing notions about the Americanized Nisei and the Japanized Kibe compounded the marginalization of Japanese American migrants in the scholarship and the public narrative of Japanese American history. But what my book shows is that the Kibe, in fact, brought with them diverse perspectives of the Japanese Empire, and they also played an important role in shaping the cultural, political, and linguistic dynamics of the Japanese American community on the eve of Pearl Harbor. For example, my book follows the transpacific journeys of Japanese American workers and migrants and intellectuals, like Oakland, California native David Akira Itami, whose story appears in chapters 3 and 4 in my book, and Glendale, California native Carl Gosei, who was a very prominent labor activist and a well-known figure in Asian American history. And both of these California Nisei spent their formative years in Japan during the period known as the Taisho era, which was a period from 1912 to 1925. And this interwar period saw an unprecedented industrial boom in Japan, which also facilitated the rise of political liberalism and social unrest with popular movements led by feminist activists, political dissidents, and labor unions. The labor movements led by Koreans and other colonial subjects from all corners of the Japanese Empire. And there also emerged literary societies and mass publication of magazines and political commentaries and a burgeoning pop culture scene. And these developments contributed to the wide circulation of new ideas. And many young Nisei migrants in Japan became exposed to and deeply influenced by these social changes that were fueled by Japan's aggressive colonial expansion in Asia. David Itami was born in Oakland, California, and he grew up in a small coastal town on the island of Kyushu during the Taisho period, and later went to school in Tokyo. And as a young man, he immersed himself in the works of Japanese modernist writers like Natsume Soseki. And he also studied classical Chinese texts, which allowed him to read materials published in China. He returned to America in the early 1930s and worked as a cannery worker and labor organizer briefly. Then he worked for a Japanese American newspaper in Los Angeles. And he was touted as someone with a nuanced understanding of the Japanese Empire. And he also established himself as a leader of the Los Angeles Kibe community. But when the war broke out in 1941, because of his status as a Kibe leader and his work as a Japanese language newspaper columnist, he was targeted as a potential pro-Japan element, and his name was turned over to the FBI. And during the war, he did what he could to prove his loyalty to the United States. He joined the US Army's military intelligence service out of the Manzanar incarceration camp, and he won the Legion of Merit Award for translating over 4,000 Japanese language documents during the war. And he went on to become a language monitor at the Tokyo war crimes trials after the war. And in 1950, he committed suicide while stationed in Tokyo as a member of the US occupation force. But these case studies in my book demonstrate the critical role that US-born Japanese American men and women played as cultural brokers on both sides of the Pacific, and who shaped the political and social relations in the Japanese American community and beyond. The book therefore offers an alternative history of the Japanese American experience before, during, and after the World War II as a series of diasporic ruptures. These young Japanese Americans found themselves negotiating complex socio-political conditions in the US and Japanese empires that help us rethink the conceptual boundaries of Asian history and American history.